I'd like to start with an observation that maybe will tee up where we go. I think in the angel pollination started in 2011. I think we've maybe had two entrepreneurs that are of color, maybe three, who presented over all those years. The number of investors that we've had participate who are of color is probably one or two, maybe not even that many. And I have to admit, it's hard for me to find where entrepreneurs of color that are building businesses of scale are located here in Minnesota, and even more so if they're indigenous, tribal companies. I don't know where to find those, and I don't know how we reach out and find investors of color and get them involved in events like angel pollination here. So I hope as you start talking about this, you can kind of fold that into this this whole thought process, because it's a frustration that I bear responsibility for myself here in our organization, of why we have not been successful, I think, over the years in broadening our base. So
Yeah,
welcome aboard.
Thanks, Jeff. For one, I just want to start off by saying thanks everybody for joining this conversation. I have to preface it because it's a delicate conversation. It's very nuanced, and I'm not claiming to have all the answers, but I've experienced it from my own professional career, and I've done a lot of research in this space. And I know that everybody's going to be on a different journey as we go down this conversation. But Jeff, to your point, one of the reasons of this talk is that very thing, this whole idea of a friendship gap, which I'll unpack a little bit in a minute, and some of the historical things that have occurred that have prevented us from forming authentic relationships easily. So just a little background, a high level. My name is Dr. Paul Campbell, co-founder of Brown Venture Group. One of the reasons why Dr. Chris Brooks and I co-founded this is because we realized there's a huge gap. There's a lot of information after George Floyd death that came out in terms of the gaps in financing and things like that. But we were kind of studying this thing back in 2018. One of the highlights, one of the things we've noticed is across Black, Latino, and Native American founders, only 13% of venture capital went to the community. But for me, it's like, well, what does that really cost us, right? How much does that actually impact us? Because for many, many years, we have felt bad about the racial inequities, but like most of us who have fiduciary responsibilities to our shareholders and investors and such like that, we want to make sure that we balance that out. We want to do good, but at the same time, we want to make sure we're doing it wisely. So a recent study came out from Citigroup, which I'm so grateful that they did, because if they didn't, I was going to do the research myself, that highlighted this $13 trillion gap in business revenue that we, the people, have missed out on because of biases that have affected all of us. And I say us because I'm part of that too. I believe that this is it's a problem that's not just a black and white issue, but I would say it's a human issue as far as how we see things. So for us, it was like, okay, if there's all this investable companies, how come people aren't actually, investing there? That's a question we want to answer. We saw from some of the research that came out of the Kauffman Foundation that entrepreneurs of color have a higher success rate oftentimes than even those of their white counterparts. Now, this is not to say that their white counterparts aren't equally as good. What it is that we have an oversaturation where people are picking up from relationships and friends that they already know, and they're not investing to communities of color. So it's not an issue of quality of the individual or race per se. It's more or less just exposure that we're going to unpack here. And then obviously we see a huge upside, in terms of the potential for these contributive colors. And we see a lot of them coming from great HBCUs, great institutions, but still because of many of the structural issues that we've had historically, is preventing them from having access to capital and access to relationship, which to me is part of that capital, relationship capital. I should point out on this thing too here, there's a very distinct difference between opportunity and capacity, right? An opportunity is an event. And so what you do with that event is the capacity that one has. And for a long time, there's been a disconnect between the capacity that's been in Black and brown communities and the opportunities that have been provided. And it's really, how do we work intentionally to start bridging those gaps to make more opportunities with people who are highly capable in that space? So the question that I want to kind of start off with too is this: what life-saving medical breakthroughs or technological advances could we have experienced had we figured a way around this issue of racial bias? And I think of my grandmother and my mom, and think about some of the solutions that have not been brought to market because of the suppression of contribution, from people of color. And so this problem, many people think about this problem being a specific Black and brown problem that we experience in our community. But the reality is every American, every person in the world is affected by the suppression of contribution from a people group. And so once we start unlocking that contribution, we start seeing the full innovative capacity of America really being engaged. And that's really where our passion is. Not about, being pro-Black and pro-brown isn't anti-white. It is, how do we co-create solutions together that can benefit everybody, and that we can start building relationships. And what better way to build relationships than starting a business together, right? So Brown Venture Group, we were formed and informed by this whole area of behavior economics. This whole idea of metacognition, thinking about your thinking, was something that was really interesting to me. I wanted to know, as a person who loved Adam Smith, who studied all the great, economic theorists, I wanted to know, why was it that what to me made perfect sense as far as why somebody wouldn't invest? Why would they hurt themselves by not investing into a particular people group? And we found that because of, like, as you start growing up, what your parents say about a people group or whatever it may be, all this stuff starts to affect the way you perceive things. And I would even go as far as to say this. Right now, if I tell people that I work with at-risk youth, the first image that comes to mind oftentimes is not a white teenager, which it could be, right? By population, it could be a white teenager. Instead, it's a Black and brown a contributor, a future contributor. And the implications of that is profound, because how much do you push a person to their full cognitive capabilities if they're at risk? You kind of have this notion in their head that they're already doomed to fail. And there was a very interesting study, if you guys want to do some side research, called the Pygmalion study, which came out back in the 60s. And they did a study of students and what teachers think of students and how that actually affected their ultimate outcomes. And what they found was, they told these teachers that we're going to take this test and we're going to show that the students in your class that are late cognitive bloomers. And so they took the test, the teachers took it not knowing what's going on from these researchers, and they randomly picked names from a hat. And then when they came back, they said, here's a list of your late cognitive bloomers based on this test. And what happened was there was subtle biases and ways that teachers would engage with these students that was different than other students. And those students, by and large, had better success in schools, became better students, just because a teacher's belief of them was there. And that has implications too on how we view communities of color. When an African-American woman is educated, she oftentimes is treated as an angry Black woman. Why do we have that stereotype? Well, that comes not from just today, but it comes way back to Sam Bone drawings and different images that were used that affected our thinking back in the right after Civil War and things like that. And so going back to this issue of behavior economics, I know there's a huge upside, and if we can glean some of these principles in our investment in thinking, we can actually make predetermined choices that would help us to kind of with our own biases, because we all have them, right? And understanding your metacognition, why is it that you think the way you think, and how does it inform the way you view, women and people of color as far as their contributions? So as I shared, I'm a big fan of, free market capitalism for many years, but I saw there was a conflict, and I want to tell a little story about my own family to kind of historically put it into context. So free market capitalism states that, you want competition, right? Competition is good for everybody. It makes everybody, better, things like that. And I started looking historically at some of the, as I call them now, barriers to contribution that existed for communities of color. For example, back when there was a thought of giving 40 acres and a mule to former slaves, there was a big problem with that, because people said, this is a government handout. This is not capitalism. We should not do this. But in the same, like just years before, there was a push to go west, and 160 acres were given to settlers to go out and colonize the West. Well, that was viewed as patriotic. That was viewed as good thing. But when it came to the application of people of color, it became, no, this is actually an issue of, a handout, right? So even myself growing up and I grew up in Virginia Beach, Virginia, and I grew up in a context where I didn't want to be associated with handouts. I didn't want to be associated with the victim mentality. All these things affected the way that even I would communicate with people around me. And as I began to study my own family history, I saw the effects of these barriers to contribution, and it actually goes into investment. So my great grandfather, his name was Columbus Johnson, and Columbus Johnson was a businessman who pioneered work to migrate former slaves from the South to the Midwest and Kansas. And the movement was called the Exoduster movement. If you guys love history, you can look it up, the Exoduster movement. And what they did, they were escaping some of the black codes that were put upon former slaves after the Civil War had ended. If you guys aren't familiar with that, a lot of those black codes were taken away, what we would consider as our American rights, rights to vote, rights to own land, rights to be educated, things that we think, why would anybody ever do that? And it was all to suppress and keep people, workers, in a state that they couldn't actually, do their own thing in terms of subsistence farming and things like that. So my family had this great history of as doing entrepreneurship. And then because of the over policing, because of all of the other systemic things that happened, you had a period of my family's history where you had drug dealers, prostitutes, pimps, and all those things that my father personally was like, we are not about that, and like, I'm looking at this history and saying, why did this happen? How could this actually be? And you start realizing the options were few. Now, I'm not justifying their behaviors because that's behaviors that I wouldn't want my kids to do. But the point is they were all expressing entrepreneurial gifts in the context that they were left over with because they had not proper investments and the cost of capital was higher. You fast forward to my father, and he started a work that was more in the nonprofit space and did some good things. But he never talked about his family because he was so ashamed. And that shame was put upon me as well. And so I was ashamed for many years of my own blackness because of what the language that was used to describe our community, just being fully transparent. But as I begin to dive deeper into this rich history, I realized this is not so. So this idea of selective capitalism, when it's convenient for a given group of contributors, you're able to basically say, we're going to not have this be, we're going to give handouts to those who can benefit from it, but we're not going to give it to black and brown, contributors. And so what you see, if you look at history, is there's many instances where it wasn't free market capitalism that was put upon contributors of color, it was selective capitalism. So for example, the redlining and the suppression of jobs made it to where and really historically the wealth creation that happened from home ownership and also the union jobs and a variety of other things, we were not able to participate in those things. And now you have a stage 2 and stage 3 implication of that we're seeing now. And the communities that were created, I use a term later on here called artificial poverty, because if you're a free market capitalist, you know that competition would be good. Any suppression, any interference to make sure that contribution was there is considered meddling, right? So what we see is artificially created poverty in the American ghetto. And it's really predictable between at-risk youth saying that, the where people were living at, the higher exposure to COVID because of asthma and other things that were going on. These are all historical things that came to be. Now, I wasn't interested in who's right and who's wrong when I was doing this research. I wanted to figure out why was it that we weren't seeing significant investment into communities of color. So this whole idea of, barriers of contribution and this friendship gap. So when you think about it, I said it earlier, somebody made a choice before many of us were a twinkle in our mother's eye, how easy it was for us to make authentic relationships with one another. Many people think of redlining as far as how it's negatively impacted communities of color, but in actuality, it's affected everybody. Because now, as you pointed up earlier on the call, Jeff, is we have a situation where we can't find investable companies of color, right? We can't find investors to come to our networking groups because there's a lack of relationship that naturally would happen if there was more close proximity. A good example of how that worked too is even with Steve Jobs when he was working at Pixar, he wanted to create a space where there's serendipitous encounters. So he built a whole place to where relationships and community were able to happen, and that innovation kind of created more opportunity for Pixar. Same thing is true when you start putting artificial barriers to communication between races and people groups, where somebody makes a choice for you as far as how easy it was. So for example, if you live in the suburbs, say you live in North Dakota and you came here to Minnesota, you didn't have the opportunity to be around people of color, right? You're not racist. You have a lot of questions. You don't know if you say people of color, African American. and that comes across as, like, well, you have this privilege. It's not privilege, it's curiosity, right? You just don't know because you have no relationship. And second thing, this artificial poverty, and the higher cost of capital. So this issue is huge, and I think even when you start thinking about policing, right, this issue, people want more police to put in the communities. I believe that the dehumanization of people of color and the dehumanization of police officers kind of lead to the same outcomes, this clash of us and them. And it really, if you think about it, is because of the artificial poverty that was created and some of the side effects that happen. The biggest gap is a friendship gap, as I alluded to. But let's talk about some concepts that are helpful to think about this issue. So historical choice architecture. Choice architecture is a concept from behavior economics that helps people make or informs the thinking based upon the environment. So for example, if you want to sell more steaks at a steakhouse, you anchor it in a lower value steak. You put a higher steak up the top there, and people are going to naturally go towards that middle steak as part of choice architecture. When you think about historical choice architecture, this artificially created poverty combined with gaps of investable companies, things like that, creates this idea that we now we see that there's no investable companies, when really there is. It's just that the way the communities have been set up, now we have a gap of relationship. This whole idea of BIPOC anchoring heuristic. So when I came to work in corporate America, I had to prove to people that I wasn't lazy, that I was qualified. Even when I went from underqualified to overqualified overnight, and nobody told me when it happened, right? It was kind of like, oh, you're overqualified. And I'm like, what? It's just a contribution. I want to have a contribution, right? I was turnaround businesses. I was top sales in the country. And there was always these nitpicky things that are, picking out as far as why I wasn't getting picked. Now, again, I had a problem with being a victim, so I didn't let that be the first point of attack. I wanted to understand why was it that was overlooked. And I realized it was many of these racial biases. When they say, well, you wouldn't fit our culture, it was really because they didn't feel comfortable with color, and that was the not fitting with the culture. So fast down to this next one here, societal availability heuristic. And heuristic, I forgot to mention, is a rule of thumb for thinking, is how we make decisions, complicated decisions easier. But the societal availability heuristic, the reason why some people were so surprised with George Floyd, thinking that we were so far past the issue of race, is because when you can bring to mind one or two successful African Americans, maybe it's athletes or whatever it may be, it gives a false perception that the overall majority of African Americans and people of color are doing better, and that racism doesn't have the same effect as far as their upward mobility in terms of providing opportunities. When the reality is, if you look at the data and you disaggregate it, even Minnesota is one of the best states to live in, to raise a family. But when you disaggregate the data, you start seeing that Minnesota is the Twin Cities specifically, is the fourth worst place for people of color to live. It has a number one worst graduation rates. And how is this possible? It's like these two different things going on at the same time. We see that because people feel like this, people are angry, upset because, they think that we're further along than we actually are. So what's the solution, right? And this is, I think it's a relational solution. We have to go through a cultural residency. We're good at picking up books, reading them, right? Taking classes on an unconscious bias. But all of that stuff is head knowledge. It's not experiential. So to answer your question earlier, Jeff, one of the best ways I think that we, as a community here in the Twin Cities, start to do this is go through the process of being uncomfortable. This cultural residency. You, as a doctor, you would never go from reading books and going to class to then doing open heart surgery, right? There's a process that you have to go through. And so this whole idea of cultural residency means that you're going to a coffee shop, you're going to places that you wouldn't normally do because of how things are set up. You have to do that, right? You have to be more intentional. And now you're starting to see, okay, these people are no longer just, people you see in the news. It's George Floyd would not be just George Floyd, it'd be George Floyd who was in my community. He was played basketball, he was this and that, and it becomes a different conversation than something that happens to an outside community. Some of the benefits, going back to the investment, conversation is, we know now there's a bunch of underinvested opportunities, right? We've seen the data, there's $13 trillion. I don't want to miss out, on the next $13 trillion. I'm sure you guys don't want to either, right? But, how do we shift the thinking? So by investing to under-invested companies, we see we're going to have a higher upside because naturally a lot of the relationships we have are maybe solely around white communities and not communities of color as well. So now we're going to get out of our community to start building relationships with people that will lend to these proper investments of underfunded companies. Second thing is it would lower the economic burden of artificially created poverty, meaning that many people have a problem with government handouts, but the government handouts are really just dealing with the symptoms of a problem that was already created by our government historically. And I love America, don't get me wrong, but this is a systemic issue that was created that no one ever, it was kind of like, well, free market capitalism will get us out of it. Selective capitalism got us into it. And then it was free market capitalism that was supposed to get us out of it, and it never really works. And then this idea of increasing both economic and human flourishing within our Minnesota community. So the call to action tonight here is, let's start by intentionally building relationships with one another. This call is one of those calls, right? I'm inviting more investors of color to be on this call. Let's be more intentional about how we build investment. Selfishly, I think partnering with Brown Venture Group to unleash the full innovation capacity of America is part of the way we can do that. But I think that the solution has to be co-created. It's not just Brown Venture Group coming in and saying, hey, we have all the answers. It's us being a part of what's already going on in the Twin Cities and changing the narrative of our area. Wouldn't it be nice if we could be known for, helping launch and scale, multiple Black and Brown entrepreneurial ventures successfully? We have really good rates in our area. Would it be nice if we could participate in the next $13 trillion opportunity, as far as investing in community of color, because it's been so overlooked? So I think that, other thing I said, starting off with Jeff, what you first talked about, there's a relationship gap that I think that's the easiest way for us to start being more intentional. And then we have some more of the long-term things like how do we fix structural issues in education and finance and things like that. But relationship, as we know, is built on trust, and trust leads to economic, transactions, right? Increases economic transactions. And so I think, I appreciate the fact you had me on this call, and hopefully the ideas that I brought up today give some people some food for thought as far as how we as a community can come together and co-create a solution that is equitable for everybody.